Okay, in the last video I'd mentioned that my fuse block cover no longer was staying on my fuse block, which is also the clamp for my handlebars. So what I decided to do was relocate the fuse block to here, along with updating it to a normal blade type fuse block. Now I need to find a place for my ignition. And as I had mentioned in the last video, the stock CX500 ignition switch is this big bulky thing that's kind of awkward to remount anywhere else besides its stock location. But what I wanted to do was find a new place for it. What I did was found this ignition switch from EMGO, which is supposed to be for Honda CB500, CB550, or CB750. Now this isn't Honda original, it's aftermarket, but I gotta say the quality is pretty good. So as you can see, what this includes is the stock replacement for the ignition switch for that era of CB and a set of keys. What's cool about this ignition switch is compared to the CX500 ignition, it's a little screw type ignition switch that has a wire that can go pretty much anywhere. So I wouldn't be so reliant on having this bulky plug needing to meet the stock plug. The downside is the CB's had a 4-prong square plug where the CX has a 6. But even though this is a 6-prong plug, it only has 4 contacts in it. So I think this can be updated to work with this. What I needed to do next was to find a mounting place for this CB ignition switch. Because obviously it's still very different than what you'd find stock on a CX, but the way that it's designed is much more flexible. To mount this ignition switch, I found this CB360 ignition mount that I think will do the job to remount this ignition switch somewhere a little bit more discreet on this bike. So what's cool is this bolts right in. This is for a CB350. I'll leave the exact information in the comments below. But what you end up with is this nice 2-hole mount, nice little shroud for it, and plenty of wiring access. So what I need to do next then to make this work with this, because we're going from basically a male 4-prong to another male 4-prong, which isn't going to work. I bought another Keep It Clean wiring connector, which is the same connector I used on the fan update to mount this to this. Now one thing I need to do is I need to check the Honda schematics to see which of these wires need to match up with these wires in a Honda CX500. But it looks like the wiring colors are almost the same, so I bet it's a direct connection. And knowing Honda and how well they were at standardizing these bikes through the 70s and 80s, the wires are probably the same, but we'll find out a little bit later in this video. Okay, so first things first. What I want to do is find a place to mount this ignition bracket. I've got a few options I'm looking at here. And second will be to wire it up, and then third will be to test it out and put the bike back together. Okay, so looking at both sides of the bike, I think this side is the better side to mount the ignition switch. I think one area that might be good would be this bracket mount point here for the motor mount bracket. The thing is if the ignition is mounted here, I've got a couple of hoses in the way, and I think it's going to be just eyeballing it. I think this is going to be a little bit close to the tank. So that means I might need to modify this bracket, which is something I really don't want to do. There's another threaded mount here, which I don't know what this is for from the factory, but it could also be a point to mount this bracket. But, again, it's going to interfere with a lot of these cables and hoses, so maybe not so ideal. The second place I found, which I do like, is through this hole right here in the frame, which is a factory hole for, I'm not sure what it was for, to be honest with you, but there's a hole here. And coincidentally, it happens to be the exact same size as the holes in this mounting bracket, so it'd be very easy to pass a bolt through there. Unfortunately, there's only one hole, so I'd only be bolting this on with one bolt for now, until I can figure out a solution for the second bolt, which could be drilling, although that's a pretty big hole to drill for 2 giant bolts for this little tiny bracket. The other thing I noticed is that located here, I don't think it's going to run into the tank, and it's also definitely not going to stick out and become an issue bumping into my knee or anything like that. So I'm thinking that this is probably the ideal location for this bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and just find a bolt to stick through here and hold this bracket on, and then do a quick test with the tank on to see if this is the place for it. It's pretty tight there, but it isn't touching the tank, which is good. I mean, it's like right on the line. I think with a little bit of work, I can make this work. Maybe just bend the bracket just a little bit. Let's see if I can just do that. There we go. Hey, how about that? So, actually, that's a pretty good location. So, all right, I'll go ahead and bolt this up. And then I've got some ideas for what I'll do for that second bolt hole, at least to get this kind of buttoned up and try it out. It actually looks pretty good. Yeah. Okay, so there's two positions on this switch. There's obviously the off position, then there's a position 1, and then there's an ignition position. And in position 1, what this does is it looks like it connects red and black, and then brown and white. Okay, so, and then in position 2, which is the ignition position, it looks like just connects red to brown. Now, the CX500 switch is just a 2-position switch. I don't really need the ignition switch. And from what I can tell, looking at the service manual here that I have, in the on position of the CX500 switch, let me go grab it. So basically, with the CX500 switch, there's off and on and P. Well, we only care about off and on. And in on, what this switch does is connect brown to brown and white and red to black, which is exactly what this ignition switch does in 1. So, and then the P mode is the ignition mode, essentially, which is red to brown on this switch. So I don't really need, there we go, back off. I don't really need the ignition mode on this switch, which is basically translating to the P mode on this switch. All I need is off and on. So it really does look like the colors just directly match up. So all I need to do with my new connector is just match the colors, and it should work. Well, as it turns out, the brown and white wire was just a little bit too short. I'm going to solder in just a small extension, give me a little more flexibility. What I hate to have happen is this wire tighten up while I'm writing and come loose. Okay, here we go. There's on. Test the fan. That's good. And let's just do a quick turnover. I think we're good.